Phreaking is actually one of my very old hobbies. So I want to take you through a little historical background on phreaking, phone phreaking. My name is Moonen. As was introduced, I'm the technical director at Secura. I'm an old school freak. So back in the days, we were playing around with analog phones and signaling systems, and it always had my interest. It was the first exposure I had to the actual hacking community. So back then, things were possible. Then security measures were implemented, and now things are possible again. And this talk is meant to give you a background on it and also introduce some research that we've done and also that Barry Busser has done. He's here. Thank you, Barry. And back in the days, for those of you that might not know a lot about phone phreaking, you had analog trunks, and the phone exchanges, they were talking to each other, and they used multi-frequency signals to do that. So I'm sure you might have heard of Captain Crunch with his 2600 hertz whistles. The first, what we call the blue box, that generated these tones to break into the signaling systems. That's one of them is pictured in the center there. That's actually one that supposedly was built by Steve Jobs, because the hacker lore goes that he sold these things on the campus university, and that was his seed money to start Apple. And of course, the well-known 2600 magazine has its name from the 2600 hertz signals that you could use to open up a trunk and inject your own signals. So these signaling systems, they're just like DTMF. You probably know that when you press a phone button, it goes T2, T2, toop. And these are multi-frequency signals. These signaling systems work like it, just with other frequencies and other codes. And sometimes you could even hear them, or you can still hear them sometimes even, when you set up a call. Somewhere in deep, dark Africa, there's a couple of old exchanges still that can be addressed like that. So it was possible to inject codes into the signaling path of the phone. I'm sure if you search well and scan phone lines, you should still be able to find a couple of these exchanges that are vulnerable to old school phreaking. So basically the gist of it was you could trick the exchange into thinking that the end user is another exchange, and he would listen and say, "Oh, you're another exchange. No problem. I will connect you to X, Y, and Z." This was done through signaling system protocols. They have weird names like R1, R2, CCITT4 and 5. And they're very funny to listen to. They make like weird modem-y like bleepy noises, but not as fast. And there's an FTP site actually that you can go to and listen to all these audio recordings of these old signaling systems. It's good fun. In the Netherlands in the 80s, there was a group that found that this worked in the Netherlands also, because the original phreaking was done in the US. Back then, the toll-free numbers that we have these days, like the 0800 numbers, they were actually 06 numbers. Those 06 numbers, starting with 022, they were toll-free back in those days. Now, of course, the 06 numbers are our mobile network numbers. And often there were like international lines, faxes, hotels, lots of modems and stuff, and they connected to America over international lines, and they allowed phreaking. So we did that quite a lot back then. Blue boxes and the other codes and other signaling systems, they used brown boxes, green boxes. There was even a rainbow warrior made that could do all these color boxes, send out all these tones, and it was good fun. Especially when social engineering the exchange operators to connecting you to whiteboard switch houses and the switches and that kind of stuff. You can actually still play around with this yourself. There's an Arduino project that you can build quite easily. and it has all these multi-frequency signaling systems integrated into it. Check it out. It's pretty cool. Then, late 80s, early 90s, it all went digital. So we went over to ISDN. And what that meant, basically, was that the signaling path for the phone got blocked for the end user. It was no longer possible. It was out-of-band signaling. We couldn't do anything with it anymore. This is also when SS7 was introduced, which is still the current international signaling network for telephone networks. And there was an interesting talk this morning by someone who had, well, devised certain ways of bypassing SS7 firewalls to reroute calls, even on a modern network. So SS7 is still used and abused for that purpose. Then we went mobile. 2G, of course, Phreaking with 2G in the beginning was not feasible. But now these days, I think everyone is aware that 2G is not very secure. The most big issue with 2G, of course, is that the network authenticates the handset with the SIM card, but this handset never authenticates the network, making it possible to set up a fake GSM network. Possible then to have the end user devices connect to your network and be a man in the middle. All you need to do this is a simple SDR, and I use HITB, which is open source software that you can get, and it works very fine out of the box. Moving on from 2G to 3G, a couple of more components were added. Security got better because now the network was authenticated. There is no more man-in-the-middling, so to speak. There were still some issues here because vendors and providers figured out that, hey, we can actually make little base stations for 3G and give them to the public, have them connect to the internet, and then use the internet connection to actually transfer the voice. So this is what they call femtocells. You can still buy them, and you plug them in, and there's been lots of hacks where you became root on this device, on the femtocell. And again, you could do lots of tricks like extracting the keys and sometimes even talk through a proxy and some translation software to the SS7 network. Fortunately, that was quickly killed. So 3G also had some hacking and phreaking possibilities if you were into hardware hacking, and I'm sure you still can get somewhere these femtocells that are hackable. We did a bit of research on that, and Vodafone did not really like that, but in the end, it all got fixed. Then, enter 4G. 4G is different because 4G is not a voice bearer like 2G and 3G. What it is a data bearer. So it's just a data channel. Now, they have implemented IP on top of that. So now we can send IP traffic, but still no voice. That is why they introduced voice over, well, 4G. The more common term for 4G in the industry is LTE, long-term evolution. So voice over LTE is basically VoIP over the 4G data channel. So it uses SIP. We know SIP. It's in RFCs. It's an open standard. And it uses RTSP, streaming sound. The signaling path, however, is handled in user space on the phone. Well, I say user space, but I mean actually it's accessible in the kernel of the phone. The voice is handled by the baseband modem, is not accessible. It doesn't matter. Signaling is back in the hands of the user where it should be. Well, not for security reasons, but for the freaks, that's of course good news. So it brings back the days of the 80s, and we can start messing about with 4G signaling again. It's SIP. We can do this. We know this stuff. So Android allows interaction with this data layer through the RMNet 0 and RMNet1 interfaces. So if you get a shell on your Android phone, you can see that it has at least these two interfaces as long as you're connected to a 4G provider that provides VoLTE. So the RMNet0 interface is the data layer that goes to the internet. You can, I don't know, browse CNN.com, whatever. That's your internet connection. The RMNet1 interface, that is your VoLTE interface. That's where the signaling is being handled. And in very many providers' implementations, the RMNet1 interface is actually an IPv6 interface. From this interface, there is usually an IPsec tunnel to the SIP proxy. You don't connect directly to the SIP server. It goes through a proxy. It's called the PCFCS. Doesn't matter for our purposes. We have something that we can talk to in a protocol that we know. So this IPsec tunnel, when it's set up correctly, of course it's encrypted. However, if you root on your phone, you can extract the policy quite easily. And with the IP transform state command, you can dump the IPsec keys. That's pretty handy. Please note that the keys are for the data layer. So it's an IPsec tunnel on the IP layer. This has nothing to do with the radio layer. And immediately, there's a couple of things that might flag attention here. For instance, an MD5 hash that's being used at this provider, and a triple des key. It's a 2-key triple des, so actually it's only 112-bit security, and with some known plaintext attacks, you can bring that down to something like 80 bits, and which is equivalent. Well, it's not very secure. Of course, as I said, you know, that still doesn't mean you can take these signals off the air and start brute forcing it, because this the radio layer is encrypted separately. So this is, you know, if the radio layer would fail for some reason or other vulnerabilities, then it would be possible to sniff the traffic and start brute forcing this, because 80 bits is icky. I mean, there are certainly capabilities out there that could crack 80 bits. There's other misconfigurations. Now, actually, after we'd done a few commercial investigations for telcos, we found a couple of these vulnerabilities in this VoLTE system, and then I said, why not research this a little bit further? And then Barry came along and, for his thesis, investigated multiple Dutch providers and made a comparison of the security state of them. So, just to give you an idea, the columns here are 3 Dutch mobile 4G providers, and you can see the differences here. 2 of them use IPv6, 1 uses IPv4. The settings that the phone uses are in a settings file, a database, or in another, a settings repository, let's call it that. You can start to change these settings, so that's what we tried. So you could disable some kind of encryption on IPsec layer, or maybe disable IPsec itself completely. This is because the standard does allow phones that do not support IPsec to connect. It's not very wise to allow it, but the standard says you can do that if you want. And one provider actually allowed that. You can also see that the IPsec encryption, you can also use null encryption within IPsec. So there's, that means there is no IPsec encryption. You can just see the traffic. And there's one provider that does that. Another one uses AES. And as you saw in the previous key dump, there's also one that uses triple des. And the key length also differs. Well, obviously, if you have null encryption, the key length is 0, but the other one uses 128 AES, and of course, triple des CBC is 192 bits, but it's 2 keys, so basically it's still 112. There's more misconfigurations. But we'll get to that in a minute. So these settings can be changed on older Androids, pre-Android 7, I believe. There's a database. It's a simple database. You can just request this file from the phone with the Android debug bridge, and then you can change the settings, or at least you can try to. One of the things, of course, is disabling the IPsec tunnel completely, or trying to downgrade encryption, or trying to use a different authentication algorithm. These things, we tried them, but were non-successful in most cases. And yeah, as I said, one at least allowed the IPsec to be disabled. On newer Android versions, there is a hidden activity that you can invoke, and then you can try and play around with those parameters from a user interface, and you don't have to do icky things with databases. So, as I said, if you're root on the phone, you can easily extract the IPsec keys, and then you can sniff the traffic. So, how do you sniff the traffic from an interface on an Android phone? Well, for starters, your phone has to be rooted, and you have to forward the traffic from the phone to your machine. And luckily, the Android debug bridge does that for you. So you can simply invoke ADB forward from a local port to a remote port. On the device itself, you can run TCP dump. TCP dump is not a part of the Android system by default. You're going to have to find a binary TCP dump to run on your phone, but it can be done. There's binaries out there, or you can cross-compile them yourself. It's not very difficult, and tools like Netcat also have been ported to Android, cross-compiled. SoCat and other tools are also available. And then on the local host, you can actually simply read that stuff and pipe it into Wireshark. So you can then see the SIP traffic. And this is where it becomes interesting, because this is a little screenshot from a session, and you can see at the top that it first starts to register. This is where the phone, the SIP channel, authenticates to the SIP server. And it does this by sending a SIP register message. However, it does this, the first time it does this outside of the IPsec tunnel. And the server says, no go. And then it says, okay, I'll do it again. Now we'll do it through the IPsec tunnel. And the server says, fine, come on in. And this is my challenge. And this challenge is then sent to the SIM card by the phone. The SIM card calculates a response based on the secret key in the SIM card and sends it back to the SIP client, which then sends it to the server. Once you've registered in that way, you get a 200 OK, and you can register the phone, and you see there's a subscribe and a notify, and then there's an invite. And a SIP invite message is basically, I want to call you. So it invites, you can see there, invite SIP, and then 06, some number, and a couple of other things using URLs and standard SIP stuff. Not going to go into that now. You get a session progress message, you get a progress acknowledge message, and again, a 200 OK. And finally, there, after the update, you get a ringing. So you know that the other side has received the message, and his phone should be ringing right now. Of course, this is the flow, and you'd think that they all follow the RFC, but this is not the case. So there's a couple of operators, and operator A follows a very, very terse form of the RFC. Operator B goes over the top and does all kinds of progress acknowledge stuff in the middle. And operator C it also has a session progress. But you see, the implementations differ, not just in the way they handle cryptography, IPsec, and the key lengths, but also actually in the flow control of the SIP messages. Some non-Dutch providers also allow data to the internet to go through ARMnet1. So you can change your routing table and access the internet over ARMnet1. It does not incur data charges that way. Luckily, this is all being fixed in the Netherlands. You could also think about tunneling through DNS on ARMnet1 because it's an IPv6 interface. It has a DNS. And you can also do some infrastructure discovery. So you can run nmap scans and all the regular stuff on ARMnet1 if you want. So the authentication bit that I just explained with the register and the challenge response actually opens up another nice little attack because it's theoretically possible, we have not implemented this, but it's theoretically possible to share SIM cards. All you have to do is when you receive the challenge, send that challenge over another channel, for instance Wi-Fi, to another phone that has an app on there that listens to that, sends it to his SIM card, sends back the challenge over the Wi-Fi to your phone, and then you have just, well, shared his SIM card. You can do this with maybe 3 or 4 people. This is a common attack also in satellite pay TV systems, where you can share the smart card of the satellite provider, so Canal Digital or whatever, and you can share multiple cards that way and share your subscription. They don't like it, but it's technically possible. And the same is possible for SIM cards over this way. So could be a possibility to deny attribution, and it would be definitely a problem for lawful interception. How do SMSs work over VoLTE? Well, the Dutch providers do not use SIP to actually send text messages anymore. There was one provider that did use SIP messages, and we found out that if we sniffed those messages and replayed them on another phone, they were sent. And they got received on the original phone, or at the recipient, as if they were coming from the original phone that the packets were sniffed from. So there was something in that packet that could be transferred to another phone, and the system didn't even charge the replaying phone. No, it billed the original phone. So there was a little problem there. Also, we could enumerate users because the session tokens that got sent in the SIP package was, well, not very entropic. You could brute force them quite easily. If you hit one that did not have a subscriber associated with it, it would throw an error, and otherwise you knew you could do that. But the most interesting thing actually is information that is leaking in the headers. So you saw the progress acknowledge message just now. In it are loads of headers, and these headers included at one point a p-access network info header that had in it the cell ID and location area code of the person that you were calling, right? So you could locate these people because you might know that there is a database. So it's opencellid.org. You just can fill in your cell ID and LAC, and it will tell you where this base station is. It's not accurate where this person is, but it's a location possibility for, I'd say about, a couple of 100 meters, maybe a kilometer around one cell. So that's a big privacy leak there. Luckily, of course, this has been fixed since. And other privacy leaks here is that when you were using the anonymous calling function with one provider, you use hash 31 hash, and then the phone call and the caller ID is suppressed. And indeed, on the display of the receiving phone, you could not see the number, except they were in the headers. So you could still see the calling number. And the email of the recipient was there also. And you didn't even have to wait until the ringing message. This was in the progress acknowledge message, which comes before the ringing. So if you abort the call and you send an abort, you still had that information without the other phone ever ringing. So it was like a stealth location and email disclosure attack, right? And VoLTE also has a little cousin. It's VoWiFi, because what you can do over the 4G data layer, you can also do over Wi-Fi. So there's a couple of providers that offer this. Wi-Fi, Wifi Bellen, I think KPN has it, and I think Tele2 also has it. It's basically exactly the same, except they use one extra IPsec tunnel to encapsulate and make the connection into the core network of the provider first. But the same tricks should be possible there. Fortunately, as I said, we've informed all the Dutch providers and they've fixed most of this stuff. However, foreign providers, I have no idea. So that gave us the idea that maybe it would be cool to be able to see all these headers, SIP headers in the traffic on the phone while you are calling. So that is why I asked Barry to write a little app called SIPWatcher. We've got it on GitHub now. You can go there. There's no guarantees. It's still semi-under development. And it works on, well, at least Samsung A3s, which is an ARM v8 architecture. We have the binaries compiled for T-Shark and TCP dump and dump PCAP that work on that A3 phone. We've been trying to port it to a more modern phone, the Galaxy S8 in the last days, but that is still under development. But we'll get there in a few days. So I'd be very interested to know if you run this app, what you see. And just to give you an idea how it works, in the background, it invokes TCP dump and T-Shark. It extracts the IPsec keys from the kernel, loads it into T-Shark, and it then dumps all the traffic on the screen. As you can see, this is the screen when you start SIPWatcher. It checks to see if the interface is there, the RMnet1. It checks to see if your TCP dump and T-Shark are there, and it also shows you the IPsec authentication key that it just got from the kernel. And then when you make a phone call, you can press Start Capture, and when you're making the phone call, the actual SIP messages are displayed on the screen. You can also, just by ticking one of those messages, actually see all the headers, and it saves it to a file on the SD card where you can, it's just a PCAP file basically, which you can then retrieve separately and load it into Wireshark if you want. So, conclusion. Phreaking is back in 2019, and it's loads of fun. So, there's a lot to be learned. We have not done many invasive attacks, so we have not tried to do call spoofing or all kinds of injection attacks on the headers. I suspect that there is a lot to be gotten there. If you start fuzzing this shit, I'm sure you'll find a lot. However, I must say that interacting with an operator's network like this is illegal in most countries. You can observe your own traffic, like we did, should not be a problem in most countries. But I'm not advocating you go out there and fuzz the SIP server of some providers. However, I think there will be quite a few vulnerabilities to be found still in the future here. So, again, I'd like to thank Barry for his work. Yeah, I mentioned it already. Responsible disclosure was followed. The providers have fixed most of this stuff. Not everything yet. I mean, I know, for instance, one provider still uses a bit of an icky encryption algorithm, but that will be solved soon. So, go out there, have fun with SIPWatcher. If you can get it compiled for a newer version of Android, I'd be very interested in hearing from you. It's up on GitHub, so take a look. That concludes my presentation. Are there any questions? I think there's a microphone coming.
You mentioned that in VoLTE, the second link is done inline again.
Yep.
Would you think that in a future version, VoLTE 2 or whatever, that's going to be changed again, to be put out of band?
I don't see how. Yeah, unless you implement it in the baseband modem and never put it in the kernel, or never bring it to Android. But I don't see how that's...
Oh, so that's
could be possible technically, but I don't think they'll be doing that. No. And I have no clue how it'll go with 5G. No clue. So, okay. For now, this works like it works. the client on the phone, the dialer app, has to be able to talk SIP because it's basically a VoIP client. So it has to be able to access that data interface that the SIP traffic goes through, which is RMNet1. It's designed, works as designed.
It's going to probably be changed eventually. But
probably, yes.
But then you need to change all the phones as well.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So how would the IP addressing on the RMNet1 interface be related to the APN you're using on your phone?
Not.
It's not.
No.
Okay.
No. No, it's an IPv6 address. It gets assigned. It's not related to the APN, as far as I know. Also I don't know of any link there.
Okay.
No.
So you were researching the SIP layer. Have you also examined the RTP streams?
No, we could not access them.
Okay.
Not through the Android kernel, because the whole RTSP layer is handled by the baseband chip. It does not become visible. We did find that once we were trying to mess with the authentication flow, and you could bring the phone in a state that some RTSP packages leaked to the RMNet1 interface. So we were able to see right after we made an incorrect authentication and a real authentication after that, it leaked some of the voice packets onto the RMNet1 interface, and we saw them in packet traces. But that was not really reproducible, and we have no clue why.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Cool. No? Okay. Well, then thank you all for your time and attention.